For 3 years, nobody in Dunmore could fix the clock. Not the watchmakers from Halifax, who drove 4 hours and charged like they were performing surgery. Not the horological specialist flown in from Toronto at a cost that embarrassed everyone involved. Not the retired engineer from Moncton who spent a weekend with his magnifying glasses and his certainty and left with neither. 17 people, 3 years. One clock that sat in the front room of Dunmore's only Heritage Inn, silent and useless, as if it had simply decided the town was no longer worth marking time for. And on the February morning that changed everything, the man who finally solved what no specialist could was the owner of a garage on Mill Road, eating a sandwich in his truck at the end of his shift. The clock had belonged to Margaret Dunbar's grandmother. That was the first thing anyone needed to understand about it. Not its age, though it was old, a Vienna regulator from the 1890s, hand-carved walnut case, a brass pendulum that had swung without interruption for over 100 years. Not its value, though it had value. The first thing anyone needed to understand was that it had belonged to Estelle Dunbar, who had brought it from Scotland in 1923 on a ship called the Arcadian, wrapped in a wool blanket and her husband's good coat, and who had set it on a shelf in the front room of the house that would eventually become the inn, and wound it every Sunday morning for 53 years without missing once. Margaret had grown up with that sound, the particular cadence of it, low and measured, the kind of sound that becomes so much a part of a place that you stop hearing it consciously and only notice when it's gone. It stopped on a Thursday in November, 3 years ago. Margaret had wound it the way she always wound it, the way her mother had shown her, the way her grandmother had shown her mother. And at some point that afternoon, between the lunch service and the start of check-in, the pendulum slowed and stopped, and the hand sat at 2:20 and did not move again. She wasn't sure, at first, that it was serious. Old clock stopped. You adjusted something, cleaned something, set it going again. Her husband Alec had looked at it that evening and shrugged in the particular way of a man who respected the limits of his knowledge. He'd said, "Call someone who knows what they're looking at." She called 7 people before she found one willing to come to Dunmore. The first specialist arrived in December and spent 3 days with the clock. He was a precise, thin-fingered man from Halifax named Pollard, who had 30 years of experience and a slightly injured air about him, as if the world had not quite properly recognized this. He opened the movement, examined every component with loop and patience, reassembled it, and set the pendulum in motion. It ran for 6 hours and stopped again at the same position. He charged Margaret $900 and sent a report she understood about 40% of, and told her the fault was somewhere in the escapement that he hadn't been able to isolate. She called the next person on the list. Over the following 2 years, Margaret Dunbar spent just over $11,000 on specialists. Not all of them were incompetent. One woman from Fredericton, a retired museum conservator named Dr. Vasquez, came closest. She spent 4 days with the clock and identified the problem as somewhere in the interaction between the mainspring tension and the escapement geometry. A combination that produced an intermittent failure that didn't show up under normal diagnostic conditions. She called Margaret to tell her she was stuck, which Margaret later said she respected more than any of the others, because at least it was the truth. The clock sat at 2:20. Margaret routed the guests away from the front room when she could, and stopped mentioning it in the inn's promotional materials. She had always described the inn as a place where old things were kept properly. The brochure had used the word continuity. She took that brochure out of circulation. What the money represented, if she was honest with herself during the longer sleeps she was not getting, was not the money. She was comfortable, not wealthy, but comfortable. The inn was full most seasons, and the summers were genuinely good. $11,000 was a real sum, but not a ruinous one. What it represented was a failure to do the one thing she had told herself she would do. Her grandmother had died when Margaret was 22. There had been a week of terrible logistics, the kind that grief requires, and at the end of it, Margaret had stood in the front room and looked at the clock and made the sort of quiet, private promise that doesn't require words, because it's made before language gets there. She would keep it going. She would not let it stop. She had let it stop. Every failed specialist felt like a specific small humiliation. Every phone call confirming that someone else had run out of ideas landed like confirmation of something she preferred not to name directly. The 18th attempt arrived on a Tuesday in January. His name was Dr. Jeffrey Strand, a horological engineer from Montreal who had published 2 papers on historic European movements and who came recommended by the Canadian Conservation Institute. He was 60, meticulous, and had a quality Margaret recognized immediately: the particular confidence of a man who expected to succeed. He circled the clock before touching it, which she had started to notice as a thing the serious ones did. He spent a week. On the morning of the 7th day, she found him in the front room with his coat on and his case half packed. He was standing at the window, not at the clock. His team, he had brought a graduate student to assist, was disassembling their equipment from the side table. Margaret stood in the doorway and didn't say anything because she already knew. Dr. Strand turned and removed his glasses and polished them with his shirt. He did it slowly. She had seen this exact motion before, in different rooms with different people, and it always preceded the same sentence. "Ms. Dunbar," he said, "I want to be transparent." She thanked him. She waited until his rental car cleared the driveway before she went back into the front room. The clock sat where it always sat, 20 past 2. The February light came through the window and caught the brass pendulum, which hung still as a painting. She pressed the heel of her hand against her sternum and breathed once, slowly. That was it, she thought. That was the last one. She wasn't entirely sure she meant it. She had thought the same thing after Vasquez, after the man before Vasquez. But this time the thought had a different quality underneath it. Less anger, more exhaustion. The specific tiredness of hope that has been extended and withdrawn too many times. She heard the back door open. Footsteps on the kitchen tiles, then in the hall. Then Nate Okafor appeared in the front room doorway with a cloth in his hand and a look on his face that said he had seen the Montreal car leave 20 minutes ago and had been deciding what to do with that information ever since. He was tall, not dramatically so, but solidly built in the way that comes from actual physical work over a long time. He had dark skin and close-cropped hair going slightly gray at the temples, and the kind of forearms that made sense when you knew he'd spent 15 years lying under vehicles. He was 38. He'd been in Dunmore for 4 years, which meant he'd arrived just before the clock stopped, though he didn't know yet what to do with that coincidence. He did small repairs around the inn. Nothing formal, nothing contracted. He rented the basement unit in the old Keating house 2 streets over, and he ran a garage on Mill Road that serviced half the vehicles in a 30-kilometer radius. He was quiet in the way that people who have been through something are quiet. Not unfriendly, just economical. He didn't spend words on things that didn't need them. Margaret had known him the way you know everyone in a town like Dunmore. Well enough to say the right things at the right moments. Not well enough to know why he'd left wherever he'd come from or what he'd been before the garage. He looked at the clock. He looked at her. She said, "That was the 18th. 3 years. Nobody can fix it." She said it the way you say something when you've stopped being embarrassed by it. Flatly, the way you state a weather condition. It was raining last Tuesday. 17 specialists couldn't fix the clock. Both true. Both just facts now. Nate looked at the clock for a moment. The pendulum. The case. The hands at 20 past 2. He said, "What's the issue?" Not performed sympathy. Not the careful professional concern she'd grown used to hearing. Just the question, the way you might ask, "What's the matter with a leaky tap?" She said, "Nobody can find where the fault is. It stops in the same position every time. The escapement they think, but they can't isolate the cause." He was quiet for a moment. She watched something happen in his expression that she couldn't quite name. A shift, very slight. The look of someone hearing a piece of information that connects to something they already know. He said, "How old is the movement?" she said. 1890s. Vienna school. Deadbeat escapement. He looked at the clock for another moment. Then she said, "The way you say something when you have completely run out of serious options, and the space between hopelessness and humor has closed to nothing. Maybe you should take a look at it." She said it mostly to hear herself say something that wasn't another specialist's name. He said, "All right." No hesitation. No qualifier. Just a plain flat yes that sounded exactly like something he'd say about a stuck exhaust bracket. She didn't entirely know what to do with that. She said, "Okay." She said she'd leave the front room unlocked. He came back at 6 the next morning. Margaret found out because Judith, who did the breakfast prep, came into the kitchen at 6:15 and said, with the mild alarm of someone who has discovered an unexpected person in a heritage building before dawn, "There's a man in the front room with a headlamp." Margaret put down her coffee and went to look. He'd set up a work light from his truck, one of those portable LED bars that throw a very flat, very white light. He'd moved the side table to get better access and set his tools out on a cloth. They were not the elaborate instruments of the specialists. They were not the rolling cases and the loop stands and the digital tension gauges. They were what he had: a set of precision screwdrivers, some feeler gauges, a loop, a small micrometer, and a notebook in which he had already written something she couldn't read from the doorway. He had the movement partially opened. He was not doing anything with it. He was looking at it. His face was very close, the headlamp at an angle, and he was simply looking the way you look at something you are trying to understand before you touch it. She stood in the doorway for a moment, he said, without turning. "You don't have to watch from there." She stepped into the room. She stood to one side, not close enough to be underfoot, and watched him work. He worked slowly. She had watched the specialists, and they had worked with a kind of trained efficiency, a practiced movement between instruments and components. Nate worked differently. He was unhurried in a way that, if you weren't paying attention, might read as uncertain. But the longer she watched, the more she understood that it wasn't uncertainty. It was a very specific quality of attention. He wasn't moving through a diagnostic protocol. He was listening. His fingertips moved along the movement's components the way you might trace the edge of something in the dark. Slow, sensitive, trying to understand through contact what the eye alone couldn't find. At one point he sat back on his heels and simply looked at the clock face. He looked at it for what she guessed was 15 minutes. She went to the kitchen twice and came back, and he hadn't moved. She put a coffee on the side table. He said, "Thanks. 2 sugars if you have it." The first day ended without resolution. He stayed until nearly 8 in the evening, by which point Margaret had given up on her paperwork and was sitting in the armchair by the window, reading a novel she wasn't quite able to follow. When he began packing his tools, she asked, "Any progress?" He was quiet for a moment, in the particular way she was already starting to recognize. A pause that wasn't evasion but precision. The pause of someone who didn't want to say more than they knew. He said, "I think I see something. I need to confirm it before I tell you. If I'm wrong, I'd rather not have said it." She said, "Fair enough. Same time tomorrow?" He said, "Earlier if that's all right." He came at 5 the second day. She had forgotten to unlock the front room, and he waited on the porch without knocking, which she found out afterwards, and which somehow said something about him that she couldn't fully articulate. She was not in the inn when it happened. She was in the back office on a call with her insurance broker about the spring renewal, talking through coverage adjustments for the garden dining edition, when the sound came through the wall. It was not loud. The clock's strike was never loud. What it was precise. One tone, clear, deliberate, the way it had always started before it ran through its sequence. And then the pendulum, the soft measured tick of a mechanism that had been built in 1893 and had run without interruption for 100 years and had been silent for 3, beginning again. She said to her insurance broker, "I have to call you back." She walked to the front room. She did not run. Her legs had the quality of legs that are not entirely sure they can be trusted, so she was careful. The clock was running. The pendulum moved with the unhurried regularity of something that had been doing this its whole life and had not forgotten how. The hands, which had sat at 20 past 2 for 3 years, were moving. Slowly, correctly. The brass was catching the morning light from the window. Nate was standing to the left of the mantel, arms at his sides, looking at the clock with the particular expression of a person who has confirmed something they believed but weren't entirely sure of until now. Not triumph. Nothing performed. The expression of someone who has done a careful job and watched it work. Margaret looked at the clock. She looked at him. She said, "You fixed it," he said. "It's running." She understood the distinction immediately. She didn't push against it. Judith appeared in the doorway behind her, because Judith appeared in doorways whenever anything happened, and Judith's hand went to her mouth. Margaret sat down on the piano bench, which was the closest thing to sit on, and put her face in her hands and cried. She did not try to stop it. She was not a woman who cried easily in front of people, and she understood that about herself and recognized that this was one of the times that understanding did not apply. 3 years. $11,000. 18 people. Her grandmother's clock. It was running. Nate did not say anything. He did not tell her it was fine or offer the professionally sympathetic set of sounds that people offer in these moments. He stood to the side of the clock and let her have it. When she looked up after a minute, he was still there, not looking away, not filling the space with comfort she hadn't asked for. She wiped her face with her sleeve and said, "I'm sorry." He shook his head once. Not dismissive, just, "No." He sat down on the small bench by the window, not across from her, not close. A middle distance that was both present and respectful. He said, "My wife died 4 years ago. Aneurysm. No warning. She was 34. He said it the way he said everything. Plainly. No preamble, no protective wrapping. Just a fact he was placing in the room because the room had called for it. Margaret went still. He said, "After the funeral, I drove back to our house in Ottawa. I sat in the driveway for 2 hours. I couldn't go inside. The neighbor from next door came out eventually and sat on the step with me without saying anything, just sat there, and that was the right thing to do. I've thought about that since. The person who doesn't try to fix the unfixable thing." Margaret looked at him. She said, "I didn't know that. About your wife." He said, "Nobody here does. That's all right." A pause. She said, "What was her name?" Something shifted in his expression. The way it shifts when you ask the question people rarely ask when you reach past the loss and touch the person. He said, "Beatrice." "We called her Bea." Margaret said, "That's a good name." He said, She was a very good name." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the clock. He said, "She would have thought it was funny, me fixing this. She thought I was wasted on cars. She thought I should be doing something that required more of me than I was doing." He paused. "I told her the cars required plenty." "What did she say?" Margaret asked. She said I knew what she meant and I was dodging the question. He almost smiled. "She was right about that." Margaret said, "Tell me what you found." He stood and moved to the clock. He pointed to a component inside the movement, a small brass piece that she could see had been recently disturbed, cleaned, adjusted. He said, "The movement was modified at some point. Probably in the 1940s or 50s. Someone replaced the original pallet fork with one from a different maker. It was a reasonable repair for the era, good quality work, but not quite the right geometry for this movement. The angle of the pallet stones relative to the escape wheel was off by 1.5 degrees. Small enough that the clock ran for decades without failing, because the tolerances were close enough. But over time, with the natural wear on the pivot surfaces, the combination of the slight geometric mismatch and the worn pivots created an intermittent binding condition. The escapement would run normally until a specific position in the oscillation cycle, and then bind just enough to stall the pendulum." She said, "Why couldn't the others find it?" He looked at the movement. He said, "Because they tested the components individually. The pallet fork tested fine on its own. The escape wheel tested fine on its own. The problem only exists when they work together at a specific phase of the oscillation. You have to watch the whole system in motion to see it, not the parts. The relationship between the parts," she said. $11,000, he said. The other specialists were working from each other's reports. By the time the 4th or 5th person came through, everyone was looking in the places the previous reports pointed. Nobody started from the beginning and watched the system move. She said, "And you knew about this, the modification." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I used to work in precision engineering. Before Dunmore, before the garage." She waited. He said, "I specialized in mechanical timing systems for aerospace and automotive applications. I know how small geometric errors compound over decades in precision movements. When you described the fault, same stopping position every time, no detectable component failure. I knew what the pattern meant. I'd seen it before." She said, "Why are you running a garage in Dunmore?" It was direct. She was aware it was direct. She said it anyway. He looked at the clock. When Bea died, he said, "I had a daughter to raise, Claudette. She was 2. The work I was doing required travel, irregular hours, the kind of schedule that consumes you. I couldn't do that work and be what Claudette needed. So I stopped doing that work." He said it without apology, without the self-consciousness of a person who suspects their choices look like retreat from the outside. He said it the way he said everything. As a true thing offered plainly, take it or leave it. She said, "And the garage." He said, "The garage lets me control my hours. I can drop Claudette at school. I can be home. I can take a day when she's sick without losing anyone's contract." Margaret looked at him. She said, "You've been fixing my gutters and patching my front steps for 2 years." He said, "The gutters needed fixing." She said, "That's not what I mean." He met her eyes. She said, "I have a question and I want you to answer it honestly." He waited. She said, "The clock you just fixed. Do you know what you're actually capable of?" He was quiet for a long moment. The clock ticked between them, measured and unhurried. He said, "I know what I'm capable of. I also know what I can't do right now. Claudette is 7. She needs her mornings and she needs her evenings, and she needs someone who is actually present and not somewhere else in their head because the job requires it. When she's older, maybe the answer changes. Right now, the answer is the garage." He said it directly, not as an apology, as a fact. She said, "How old is she?" He said, 7 in March. She said, "Does she know what you used to do?" He said, "She knows I know about engines. She's started asking questions about the mechanical ones, the ones that don't run on batteries." He paused. "Last month, she asked me how a pendulum knows when to stop. I told her it doesn't know. That's the point. It just keeps going until something stops it." She thought about that for a while and then said, "That's sad." Margaret looked at the clock. She said, "It is a little sad." He said, "I told her it's also what makes it reliable." The clock ticked. The winter light was moving across the floor. From the kitchen, she could hear Judith beginning the breakfast preparation, the sounds of a house that has returned to its regular pace. Margaret said, "Have you eaten?" He said, "I had something in the truck." She said, "Come and have breakfast." He said, "You don't need to." She said, "I know I don't need to. Come and have breakfast." The news broke the following day, which was faster than Margaret had expected. But then she had underestimated the particular velocity of information in a small town where everyone knows which cars are parked outside which buildings before 9 in the morning. By noon, 3 people had called to ask if it was true. By 2 in the afternoon, the owner of the Dunmore Clarion, which published on Thursdays and Wednesdays online, had emailed asking if she'd speak on record. By evening, someone had posted about it in the Regional Heritage Preservation Group, and the post had been shared 47 times. Margaret called Nate. She said, "It's moving faster than I expected." He said, "I heard. Bert from the hardware called this morning to congratulate me. I don't think Bert has ever called me for any reason." She said, "There's going to be media interest. Not large, but some. Regional papers at least. Possibly a heritage publication. I want to manage how your name gets used before it gets used without your input." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I'd rather it didn't get used at all." She said, "That option may be closing." A longer pause. He said, "Claudette's school." She said, "I know." He said, "If someone goes to that school and asks about her," she said, "I will make sure that doesn't happen." That's a promise, not a figure of speech. Another pause. She could hear him thinking. He said, "What do you want to say?" She said, "That a local craftsman with extensive technical knowledge solved a problem that brought in specialists from 3 provinces. That the solution required understanding the system as a whole rather than its parts. That it took someone who looked at the clock without the weight of everyone else's previous conclusions." He said, "That's accurate." She said, "I'm not going to mention aerospace. I'm not going to mention your background specifically. I'll say mechanical engineering background, general terms." He said, "That's all right." She said, "One more thing." He said, "Go ahead." She said, "There may be people who ask whether you'd consult on other heritage restoration projects. I'm not asking you to do that. I'm asking whether you want me to deflect those inquiries on your behalf, or whether you want to know about them and decide case by case." He was quiet for a while. He said, "Tell them I'm not taking on restoration work right now." That's the honest answer. She said, "Is it the permanent answer?" He said, "It's the answer for now." She said, "All right." She paused. She said, "Nate." He said, "Yeah." She said, "Thank you. Not the professional version, the real one." He said, "I know the difference. You're welcome." The Clarion piece ran on Wednesday. It was careful and well written and focused on the clock rather than on him, which was what she'd asked for. The Heritage publication picked it up a week later and ran a longer piece that was technically detailed enough to interest the people it was written for and general enough not to embarrass anyone. 3 watchmakers from outside the province sent emails asking if he'd consult. He didn't respond to them. She deflected 2 calls on his behalf and fielded one herself from a woman in Victoria, who turned out to be a horological historian writing a paper and who was primarily interested in the modification to the pallet fork, which Margaret was able to describe with enough accuracy, having absorbed his explanation, to satisfy her. A heritage furniture restorer from St. John left a message on the inn's general line asking if Mr. Okafor would look at a 19th century long case movement that had been defeating her for 8 months. Margaret passed the message to Nate. He sat on it for 4 days and then called back and said he'd come on a Saturday. She found out later, from the restorer, who called to thank the inn for the connection, that he had spent 3 hours with the movement and identified a cracked suspension spring hidden behind the original backplate, found by someone who had looked at the whole thing rather than the most likely suspects. The restorer said, he saw it by watching the pendulum rather than the movement. He said, the pendulum's behavior told you more than the instruments did. I've been doing this for 22 years and I learned something. Margaret didn't mention this to Nate for several weeks. When she finally did, she said it carefully. She said, the restorer in St. John called. He said, I know. She sent a very nice card to the garage. She said, you taught her something. He said, she already knew most of it. Margaret said, you're very resistant to the idea that you're good at this. He said, I'm not resistant to it. I know I'm good at it. I'm resistant to what comes after. She said, what comes after? He said, the story. The thing where the story becomes its own thing and starts requiring you to perform it. He shrugged, which she had learned was his way of indicating that a thing was true, but he preferred not to discuss it extensively. Bea used to say I had a talent for showing up right at the moment people needed something fixed and then immediately becoming invisible again. She thought it was a form of self-sabotage. Margaret said, was she right? He said, probably. She usually was. A pause. He said, she would have had a lot to say about the clock situation. She had a thing about heritage buildings. She would have been in this inn every weekend if we'd lived here. Margaret said, you can still come on weekends. You don't need a reason. He looked at her. She said, I mean that as a standing invitation, not as a favor. I like the company. He said, Claudette would eat your kitchen out from under you. She said, Judith would consider that a personal challenge, and I'd like to watch it play out. He almost smiled. The almost smile she'd been watching for months was getting closer to an actual smile. It was taking time. That was all right. The following March, on a Saturday morning when the snow was doing the unreliable thing it did in New Brunswick in early spring, present 1 hour, absent the next, reconsidering its options, Nate appeared at the inn's back door with Claudette, who was 8 now, and who had grown her hair out over the winter into something her father had described on a previous visit as aggressively braided. She was wearing a red coat too big for her and rubber boots that had pandas on them. She walked into Margaret's kitchen with the particular confidence of a child who has been here enough times to know where things are. She said, Is there tea? Margaret said, There is always tea. Claudette said, Good. Dad said we could stay for a while if it was all right. She set her backpack on the kitchen bench and unzipped it and produced a library book about mechanical systems for young readers that Nate had clearly had a hand in choosing. She said, I'm doing a project about how pendulums work. Miss Arsenault said I could pick my own topic. Margaret said, and you picked pendulums. Claudette said, Dad explained them to me. She flipped the book open to a page she'd dog-eared. I want to know why they keep such good time. Like, why is a pendulum more accurate than just guessing? Margaret sat down at the table across from her. She said, Have you asked your dad? Claudette said, He explained the physics. I want to know the why, not the how. Margaret looked at her. She said, I think those might be the same question, asked at different scales. Claudette considered this very seriously. She said, Maybe. She wrote something in her notebook. She said, Your clock is really old. Margaret said, It is. Claudette said, Dad said it was broken for 3 years. Margaret said, It was. Claudette said, and everyone said it couldn't be fixed. Margaret said, A lot of people said that, yes. Claudette looked at the book and then at Margaret. She said, But it could be fixed. Margaret said, It could. Claudette said, Because Dad looked at it differently. Margaret said, Because your dad looked at the whole thing instead of just the pieces. Claudette wrote that down too. She said, I'm going to use that in my project. Nate appeared in the kitchen doorway with his coffee. He looked at his daughter's notebook and then at Margaret, and he had the expression she had come to recognize over the past year. The particular contained warmth of a man who loved his child so completely and so practically that he rarely needed to perform it. He said to Claudette, What are you writing down? She said, Margaret said something good, he said. She usually does. He sat down at the table. The three of them sat in Margaret's kitchen while the snow considered its options outside, and Judith moved around the periphery of the room preparing things, and Claudette asked questions about pendulums that got progressively more sophisticated until Nate and Margaret were both answering together, trading the technical and the contextual back and forth in a way that felt, if you weren't paying attention, like a thing that had been happening for years. The clock ticked in the front room. Steady, unhurried, the same cadence it had maintained since 1893, interrupted once, restored by someone who had understood that the problem was never in the parts, but in the space between them. Over the following months, the St. John Rester sent 2 more referrals. Nate went both times on Saturdays. He didn't advertise it. He didn't change the sign at the garage or mention it to the people who brought their trucks in during the week. Margaret knew, and Judith knew, and Claudette knew, because Claudette knew most things eventually, and one afternoon she said to her father, "Is this what you did before?" He said, "Something like this." She said, "Why did you stop?" He said, "Because I needed to be somewhere else for a while." She thought about this. She said, "Are you done being somewhere else?" He looked at her for a moment. He said, "I don't know yet. Maybe." She said, "I think you should do more of it." "The clock stuff," he said. "Do you?" She said, "You're good at it, and you seem like yourself when you do it." He said, "I seem like myself when I'm at the garage too." She said, "Different." She looked at her book. "Not bad different, just more." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're 7." She said, 8. He said, 8. She said, "I'm just saying what I see." What she saw, though she didn't have the language for all of it yet, was her father in the 2 modes she had watched her whole life. The competent, steady, present mode of the garage, which was real and which she trusted. And the other mode, the one that appeared when he was working through something genuinely difficult, when the problem required the full depth of whatever he had accumulated across the years. Those were different. Even to an 8-year-old, they were different. He had stopped using that second mode for a long time. She had never seen it, not clearly. But she could see it now. He started accepting the referrals on a more regular basis. He didn't frame it as a career shift. He didn't mention it at the garage or change anything visible. He just started saying yes more often on Saturdays. And Margaret started fielding the inquiries as they came in. And the arrangement organized itself around the shape of the life he'd already built, rather than requiring him to build a different one. Claudette's project on pendulums won a Regional Science Fair award in April. Her board included a diagram she'd drawn of the inn's clock movement with the modified pallet fork highlighted and annotated in her own handwriting. Her explanation of how a geometric error of 1.5 degrees could compound over decades was, according to the judge who wrote the comments, remarkably precise for her age group. She said, when she showed the award to Nate, "I want to learn how to do what you do." He said, "You are learning. You just did it." She looked at the award and then at him. She said, "Will you teach me properly?" He said. "When you're ready for the proper version, yes." She said, "I'm ready now." He said, "Let's start Saturday." Saturday arrived. He brought her to the inn, which had become the place where the serious conversations happened. Possibly because the clock gave them a subject, and possibly because Margaret made better tea than anyone else in Dunmore, and possibly because the kitchen had a long table with good light and enough space to lay things out. He put a small mechanical alarm clock on the table, one he'd pulled from the back shelf of the garage, an old West clocks from the 60s, the kind that sold for $1 at every estate sale in the province. He said, "Tell me what you see." She picked it up. She turned it over. She looked at the face, the case, the winding mechanisms. She said, "It's a clock." He said, "Look closer." She looked closer. He said, "What does it do?" She said, "It tells time." And it rings. He said, "How does it know when to ring?" She started to answer and then stopped. She looked at the clock differently. She said, "Oh." He said, "What?" She said, "It doesn't know. Something has to tell it." He said, "What tells it?" She looked at him. He said, "That's the question. That's always the question. Not what's broken. What's the relationship between the things that makes the whole thing work?" She wrote that down. She had brought her notebook. Margaret at the kitchen counter, making tea, did not say anything, but she looked at the 2 of them at the table. The man who had arrived in Dunmore with something put away in him, and the girl who had inherited his way of looking at things and was only now beginning to understand the scale of it, and she felt the quiet particular feeling of being present at the beginning of something. The clock in the front room ticked on. It had been ticking for 8 months now without interruption. Every Sunday morning, Margaret wound it the way her grandmother had wound it, the way her mother had wound it after that. Some Saturdays, when the restoration work allowed it, Nate was there when she did it. He never said much about it. He'd watch her wind it, and then look at the movement for a moment, and then go back to whatever he and Claudette were working on at the table. But he noticed. She could tell he noticed in the way he noticed things. Quietly, completely, without needing to announce it. One Sunday in May, when the lilacs along the property fence were doing the thing they did for 2 weeks every year that made the whole town smell like something worth staying for, he was there when she wound the clock, and afterwards he stood in front of it for a long moment. He said, "It's going to need a service in about a year. The pivot surfaces on the main wheel. I can do it if you want." She said, "I know you can." He said, "That's not what I asked." She said, "Yes, please." He looked at the clock. He said, "Bea would have come to this inn every single weekend." Margaret said, "I know. You mentioned." He said, "I'm just saying it again because I keep thinking it's more true every time I come here." She said, "Then keep coming." He looked at her. She said, "You and Claudette, keep coming. That's not a business arrangement. That's not about the clock. That's just come here. There's always tea. And Judith always makes too much food, and the table in the kitchen fits more people than currently use it." He was quiet for a moment. The lilacs moved in the light wind outside. The clock ticked. He said, "All right." He said it the way he said things he'd actually decided. Simply, with no performance of the weight of it, even though it had weight. Even though for a man who had spent 4 years making sure that nothing required more of him than he could reliably give, saying all right to something open-ended was not a small thing. But that was what she had learned about him over this year, that the small-sounding things were often the ones with the most underneath them. The clock stopped. The clock was fixed. The man who fixed it had shown up in her town carrying something he'd put down and not yet picked back up, and Dunmore, in its ordinary, reliable way, had handed him a reason. He stayed for lunch. Claudette ate enough for 2 people, and asked Margaret 17 questions about the inn's history, and at some point migrated to the front room and sat on the floor in front of the clock and watched it run with the focused attention of someone memorizing something they intend to understand completely. Nate found her there after lunch. He sat down on the floor beside her. She said, without looking away from the clock, "Why does it make that sound?" He said, "The tick, the escapement releasing under tension. Each beat is the wheel advancing 1 tooth," she said. "So every tick is actually a tiny catch and release." He said, "That's exactly what it is." She thought about this. She said, "So it's not the pendulum keeping time. The pendulum is just measuring the releases." He looked at her. He said, "Yes." She said, "That's different from what I thought." He said, "What did you think?" She said, "I thought the pendulum was in charge." He said, "The pendulum is the standard, but the escapement is what applies it." She sat with that for a moment. She said, "Which one is more important?" He said, "They're both nothing without each other." She looked at the clock. She said, "That's like most things, isn't it?" He said, "Yeah, it is." The clock ticked. Claudette leaned slightly against her father's arm without apparently noticing she'd done it. He didn't move. Outside, the lilacs held their 2-week miracle. And in the front room of a small heritage inn in a small New Brunswick town, a clock that had been silent for 3 years continued to do the only thing it had ever been built to do. Keep time. Measure the releases. Hold the standard. Tick on.